Hi everyone, and welcome to our fourth set of remote lectures for Art History 368, History of the Classical World. Today is our second set of thinking a little bit more broadly about how the landscape features in, and we're both going to be talking about representations of the landscape in ancient art, especially focusing on Roman art, as well as talking about the role that the landscape plays in creating an artistic environment itself. So I'm going to start today's lectures by talking a little bit about representations of landscape before the Roman period. We're going to be revisiting some things that we've seen briefly before in the past and thinking a little bit about how these representations of the landscape before the Roman period compare to the sort of larger body of Roman work that we'll be looking at in the remaining lectures. So to start off, back to our Minoans, all the way back to our Bronze Age Minoans in the Aegean Sea. I remember I showed you this very briefly in an early class. This is the spring fresco from Thera, and it's sort of one of these earliest representations of a landscape on a large scale. So what we have are three walls of a room, each of which displays these sort of multicolored rock formations that are sort of curvaceous and natural, or at least sort of organically asymmetrical rock formations. And then we have blooming flowers growing out of the rocks, and these sparrows, the kissing sparrows being one of the most sort of famous images from Minoan art. So just a little reminder, here we have Thera, also known as Santorini, a little bit north of Crete, where Knossos is. And this Thera is the volcanic island that suffered a very large eruption and had its everything on the island was destroyed in that eruption in about 1500 BCE. And so as we've seen in other pieces of Minoan art in the past, here the landscape, it's very organic. We have these sort of, these asymmetrical forms, a real attention also to the way that patterns show up in, sorry, my cat's coming in. The way that patterns show up in the sort of textural surfaces, surface details. We have an interest also in patterning on the way that we see the leaf arrangements and the bud arrangements on these flowers, and in the shape of the birds, as well as sort of interest in curvilinear design elements as they show up in nature, but also represent balancing that sort of interest in patterning with a commitment to representing some of the organic unpredictability of the natural world as well. And if you'll also remember some of the other ways we saw nature represented in Minoan society, there was a great emphasis in some places on showing sea creatures, such as in the ceramics that we saw. And then, of course, the famous bull leaping frescoes showing some of the ways in which animals, both wild and domesticated, might play a role in Minoan life and be worth representing in art. So to sort of hop onto another culture and rough, 100-year later time period. If we look at our 18th dynasty of Egypt, right, this is the dynasty that leads up to and then includes Akhenaten at the end. In Egypt, we see the natural world and elements sort of the natural world not only reflected, as we discussed before, in some of the sort of color schemes, that red desert chaos versus black fertile Nile basin, continued life and stability, that sort of color dynamic, not only in that, but also in using elements of the natural world as integrated into architecture, right? So here we have from the Great Temple of Ammon in Karnak, Egypt, these pilasters that sort of take on, or they don't take on the form, but they represent the form of both lotus flowers and papyrus reeds. So elements of the Nilotic scene, the Nilotic landscape again, that were really prominent and important in Egyptian society, and that also had these sort of shapes that could easily be translated into architectural forms due to their sort of strength, their stability, their similarity to things like columns and pilasters. We also see this on a smaller scale, right? Not only in these large sort of public structures, but also in smaller works of art. such as these faience vessels. We have here a lotus-shaped cup, a chalice cup, that again takes on the form of that sort of common natural sight of the lotus flower, something that would be blooming every spring alongside these really important cycles of life and death and rebirth that are so foundational to the rhythms of Egyptian culture. And then, of course, on the plate, we have representation of the fish that we would be seeing in the river, as well as further plant buds, just emphasizing, again, the sort of fertility of the Nile Basin, the importance of these natural forms becoming integrated into the visual culture of daily life, as well as the really sort of important official state visual culture as well. To look again back at Greece, a little reminder about Mycenae. So here we are a few hundred years later again with the Lion's Gate, using the sort of power of nature, harnessing the image of nature as a representation of the power of human beings. So we have the lions as this symbol of sort of, again, strength, stability, potency, as well as this earlier dagger with a lion hunt, which shows sort of human abilities to conquer even the fiercest beasts of nature. So again, emphasizing the sort of ability of humans to actually control the natural world and harness its power to protect themselves and become a powerful culture on their own. There is also, as we have seen in other places, that sort of alternative route, right? So we have the sort of conquest over the power of nature, harnessing the power of nature. And then we also have imagery of abundance as a way of displaying a sort of harmonious relationship with the natural world, maybe even a preferential relationship, a culturally preferential relationship with the natural world, a better one than one's enemies, for example. So if we go back and look at our Persian Apadana reliefs, skipping ahead almost a full 1,000 years here into the period of Achaemenid Persia, you'll remember that we saw trees lining the staircases here as alongside these reliefs of the tribute bearers from the sort of vassal kingdoms of the Achaemenid Empire here at this audience hall in the ceremonial capital of the Persian Empire, Persepolis. And then we had not only the sort of tree procession showing the natural abundance of wood, which in this time and place is a really important commodity and a luxury commodity as well. And then we had the sort of use of these natural tree elements as framing devices to separate our delegations on the processional reliefs as they move towards the center where they would meet the king himself. Alongside any actual visitors to the site. So here we have also the bearers of gifts of animals in these delegations to the king, as well as other natural resources that are sort of significant to the local culture of the place. So showing the reach of the empire, showing the way that all of these different natural resources can be harnessed by the Achaemenid Persian king as a sort of central figure, and the ability of Persia to sort of have its claws in all of these places, but represented as a very sort of positive abundance rather than a sort of direct image of conquest itself, as we saw with the lion hunts, for example. If we turn to our sort of Greek and Etruscan Magna Graecia period, first with our black figure vessels, here we can see an example of the way that location actually in the natural world as a location of myth becomes a really prominent imagery theme in the imagery that we see. So this is just one example of a black figure hydria that shows a myth in which the god Hermes sort of rustles the cattle of the god Apollo and hides them in this cave, which we see here represented by the sort of boughs and the branches that are growing over the mouth of the cave, and we see the cows sort of disappearing behind the rock. So the use here of landscape features to sort of signal the importance of the setting and In myth, we so often see that some sort of natural feature is at play, plays an important role, whether that be a mountain where someone is hidden for a period of time, or some sort of particularly rare item or element that needs to be fetched and used in some way. So we see really important ways in which the mythological realm becomes rooted in landscape features, which is going to come back around later when we look at some of the Roman gardens and look at the aesthetics of violence article that you read for this week. So this is an Etruscan example. If we look at a Greek version here, this is a little bit later, so we're in around 420 BC. This is a red figure crater showing a scene from the Iliad. And I think this example shows something interesting that also shows up later in our Roman works, where we have a scene from the Iliad where a Trojan spy has been caught lurking by Diomedes, a Greek hero, and Odysseus, the sort of wily Greek hero that we know from the Odyssey. And these two kill him, and then they steal his clothing, and then they go and they wreak havoc on the Trojan camp, and they kill a whole bunch of Trojans. So for the Greeks, this is a very successful battle, but it is a moment in the Iliad where we have a sort of inversion of heroic behavior, which is, as we've seen in maybe our battle scenes earlier, usually very face-to-face oriented. And instead we have this scene of deception, of sort of non-heroic acts of killing where by being sneaky. And this, in this case, is set in a forest, right? A place that is easy to hide. And the use of a forest as a sort of liminal location where difficult and dangerous things happen is something that we will see a lot, right? Those are sort of places where the lack of control of the natural world, the danger of the natural world can be seen to play out. So here we see that sort of early on in this Greek red figure crater in an interesting way. So what I want you to do before we move on and start thinking a little bit more about the natural world and the Roman sphere, I want you to sort of revisit your virtual Roman house that you chose for previous assignments in the first set of weekly questions that you did. And just see if you can identify any representations of elements of the natural world in that house's decoration. And then does that house have any identifiable outdoor space like a garden or a little planting bed or even an atrium that is open to the sky that you can identify from the sources that you've been looking at? Just take note of that and we'll be coming back to it. And I am looking forward to doing the next round of lectures.